Hi class, so today we're going to be talking to you about Chapter 2. This will be the first half of Chapter 2, Native Americans, Deculturalization, Schooling, Globalization, and Inequality. We are Sarah, Madee, Jordan, and TJ. And first we're going to start with a little bit of context. So for you to understand the time period of this chapter, we're talking about globalization and imperialism. And these concepts are the idea of spreading Western culture and deculturalizing the Native American populations of the area at the time. So this led to the erasure of culture and displacement of indigenous peoples in North America. This was happening in North and South America at the time, but we're specifically talking about the Native American peoples in the U.S. territories. And education and religious conversion were used as tools for deculturalization. So we're going to talk about this notion and this belief that by using the education system or implementing a public education system for the tribes, that the United States would be able to basically wipe out the culture of Native Americans in one generation and use that generation to assimilate them to Western culture. And this included Christianity, speaking English, and general Anglo-Saxon values and lifestyle. We're also going to talk about the citizenship. Native Americans were first categorized as domestic foreigners in the US, and they were not permitted citizenship on the basis of not being white and having a misunderstood culture. In 1867, the Indian Peace Commission changes the approach to conversion and assimilation. So at this point, they decided to switch to making citizenship an incentive and having this idea of integrating Native American peoples into the U.S. culture by claiming them and trying to change them and assimilate them to meet Western values. In 1901, the citizenship was granted to the 5 civilized tribes. This is put in parentheses, and you'll see civilized used in parentheses throughout our presentation because we really want to recognize and acknowledge that civilized was a term used by the United States people and government at the time when talking about Native Americans. And it's really problematic at its core because Native Americans were not uncivilized. They simply had a culture that was different from the Westerns coming into their land. And really, if you look at it, it was the European Americans that acted so atrociously and uncivilized in how they treated the Native American peoples that inhabited the land originally. And then in 1924, Indian Citizenship Act grants citizenship to all Native Americans. So also important to recognize here that this is relatively recent in our history. 1924 was just about going on 100 years ago. And in this presentation, we're talking about the Native American experience dating back hundreds of years even before that. So in the general timeline, which TJ is going to go into in a little bit, this is pretty recent history for Native American tribes. And it's also important to recognize that this only happened after winning Indian wars and confiscating Native American lands. So it wasn't until they were disempowered to a point where tribes were no longer considered a threat to the US government. And so at that point, they were able to adopt them into society in their view. But it wasn't until they were no longer threatened by them because of how much the US had disempowered them at that point. So an overview, we're talking about school as a method of deculturalization. The US moved from the use of trade to education as a method for assimilating Native Americans to Western European culture. We're also going to be talking about the missionaries and their roles as educators in the first schools, and how religion is inherently interwoven with the culture. And then the development of the written Cherokee language, because we also want to add dimension and recognize that the Native American peoples did undergo atrocious treatment and have a rich traumatic history in our history. But that's not all that there is to their culture and to their identity. And we want to recognize that there's lots of other stories and lenses that should be brought to the table, and that their culture really found a way to survive some pretty horrendous treatment and still have strengths such as the Cherokee language, which was developed by Sequoia. And Maddie's going to tell you a little bit about that, or sorry, Sarah will tell you about that a little bit later. All right, so I'm going to pull up TJ's voice here for you, and he's going to tell us about our timeline.
Is the journey of Native Americans to gain citizenship in the United States. And it starts off with the Naturalization Act of 1790, where this denies Native Americans of U.S. citizenship altogether. And they just weren't allowed to become citizens just yet. And little do they know, it was a long road ahead of them. Going to be over 100 years until they do gain U.S. citizenship. The next step was in 1830, was the Indian Removal Act, which kicked these 5 Native American tribes off of their land, and it started the Trail of Tears, which is basically their journey once they got kicked off, and how they had to go and try to figure out and start a new life after they got removed from their land. So that was in 1830. In 1901, these 5 tribes who got sent on the Trail of Tears and got kicked out were granted citizenship. Now, it wasn't a nationwide, all Native Americans were granted U.S. citizenship, but these 5 tribes, which were the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminole, were all granted U.S. citizenship. And then finally, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was when finally all Native Americans were granted with U.S. citizenship. So the Naturalization Act, which denied Native Americans of U.S. citizenship, was in 1790, and it wasn't until 134 years later, in 1924, that they were finally granted U.S. citizenship. All right, so this is going to go over everything that Native Americans had to go through in order to receive education, and how this whole process really began. And it started off in 1819. It was the Civilization Act, which basically gave money and supported schools among the Indian tribes to try and deculturalize them, to make them more European. Basically, James Monroe didn't want any Native Americans in the country, didn't want them to have any power. So if they were going to stay, they wanted to try to make them more European and more white. And that's what happened with the Civilization Act, 1819. After this, 1821, only 2 years later, this is when we started kind of seeing a huge rise and beginning of education with Native Americans, which led to the Sequoia alphabet, which is the Cherokee language. And there was 86 symbols. It was a way that they could put the language that they spoke into writing, and it was the first alphabet for the Cherokee to be written. So that was a huge step for them. Then in 1829, there was the first Cherokee newspaper, which is called the Cherokee Phoenix, which is just another major step in the right direction. And then, right when things kind of start to look like they're getting a little better, things change, right? So in 1830, Indian Removal Act, 1830 happens, and this is basically when the Civilization Act, which was in 1819, didn't work out. They felt like that the Native Americans were not becoming more European. They were trying to deculturalize them, but it wasn't working. They basically removed the Indian land to give to white people. And some of the Native Americans tried to stay, and some just left peacefully. Basically, they said, since these people aren't really becoming the white people we want them to be, we're going to steal their land from them. And it's just another hardship that they had to go through. And this is just for education, and it's just things that they had to go through constantly throughout history. 1867, we had the Indian Peace Commission. Basically, the government was going to abandon some of their military outposts, and they were going to build additional Indian agencies in the area, set aside some land as unceded Indian territory. And this was huge because, this was 37 years after the Indian Removal Act, where they're getting rid of the land firm, and now there's actually some land that is set aside now for Indian territory. And then 12 years following this, in 1879, we have the first Native American school. It was the Carlisle Indian School. And basically, this was a boarding school movement, which was still not good for the Native Americans. It basically was a boarding school that was removing the Native American kids from their families. It was deculturalization through removal from family. So although these kids finally got a chance to get an education, they had to leave their family in the process, still making it not right and unfair for these Native Americans.
All right, and then talking a little bit about the missionary educators. All Christian denominations believed in the total repudiation of Native American culture and the adoption of Christian values. So the denominations that we're referring to here are the Protestants, which were the major missionaries implemented into the school system as the first teachers, and then also the Presbyterians and the Baptists. And all of these Christian denominations worked to deculturalize the Native American tribes, mostly by involving themselves as educators in the public school system to teach them English and teach them Christianity, but also in the tribal governments too. So the Civilization Act, which TJ touched on, also subsidized Protestant missionary educators in tribal schools in an effort to civilize tribes. And again, that's in parentheses because what we're really talking about here is deculturalization, not civilization. And that also included conversion to Christianity, which was really deeply woven in with Western culture. And then the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. This was a Presbyterian affiliated missionary group which viewed Manifest Destiny as a justification for their role in the Native American public school system as well as their governments.
Hi class, my name's Madee, and I'm going to be presenting the chapter highlights for Thomas L. McKinney and speaking about the educational impact he had on Native Americans. Before we go in, though, I do want to disclaim my own personal bias as I am an Indigenous woman. So I will be bringing that into this conversation. So if you look over here, we have a picture of Thomas L. McKinney. He was the head of the Office of Indian Affairs from 1824 to 1830. He was also Quaker, which gave him religious bias towards the Native Americans because he did want to move west, like many other imperialists at the time who believed that God gave them the right to move west in the US, which is why his office addressed Indian issues, because they wanted to relocate and reallocate these indigenous people. So he advocated for the deculturalization process of indigenous people. What is the deculturalization process? Essentially, it's creating public schools for Indigenous communities. So this was either on or off the reservation. It forced Indigenous communities to go to school in the American education system. And it also wanted the removal of Native Americans, pushing them westward. If you know This was targeting the 5 civilized groups today, which would be including some nations like the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and the Choctaw nations. So he pushed for schools that could educate and civilize, in quotations, the indigenous people. What do we mean by civilize? Many American people saw that the Native Americans were considered what they saw to be barbaric and tribal, because they misinterpreted the culture of many indigenous people. So in these schools, they taught them to read, write in English, and then also arithmetic by missionaries, educators. The Civilization Act was also adopted in 1819, creating boarding schools for assimilation to occur. So I want to point out this picture in the corner over here. At the time period, they were taking Native Americans from their home and forcing them to go to schools off their reservations to learn to be like Americans. So I want to point out in this photo what they're wearing, what they look like. So if you look at this photo, this is not traditional Native American clothing or culturally what they would wear personally. If you look at it, they're wearing collared shirts, button downs, dresses, pants. Their hair is shaved differently. This is typically the Western look, which is what they were forcing upon them. You don't really see indigenous looks on these people other than their facial features. So you could tell just from this photo that they were upset and that this was not the best or welcoming environment. It was just a force upon them. I also want to point out in the photo of Thomas L. McKinney, if you look up here, there's indigenous people in the corner of his photo, and it looks like they're happy. So I think whoever painted this photo must have been an advocate for indigenous removal, clearly, because they're making it seem as if McKinney helped, or like the white savior, if you will. So moving on to this next slide, I have a quote from Thomas L. McKinney that says, "I did not doubt then, nor do I now, the capacity of Indian for the highest attainment in civilization in the arts and religion, but I was satisfied that no adequate plan had ever been adopted for this great reformation." So McKinney here is basically explaining that civilization would be the best opportunity for many Native Americans, and forcing this upon them was a great idea. And what sits with me in this conversation is that they willingly and truly advocated for the taking away cultures and their own personal beliefs from the indigenous people to make them seem more Americanized and fit into American society. So it's really, truly upsetting to allow such problematic and terrible conditions be put upon Native Americans just to make them seem more American, even though Americans chose to not understand their culture. So on this next slide, I want to bring up the assimilation stories and how Indigenous people felt in these boarding schools. So here is a poem given by Louise Eldrick. Her father was put into one of these boarding schools. So she, in her poem, discusses what it was like to be an Indigenous person in these boarding schools. Looking at her poem, just pulling a few lines here. "Write in scars that you cannot get lost. Home is a place they cross." She also says, "We know that the sheriff is waiting at mid-run to take us back." And she says, "All runaways wear dresses, long green ones, the color you would think shame was." And then she discusses more injuries and the treatment that they had to do to get out of this unsafe environment, and truly is uncomparable to what the political system was saying that Indigenous people need these schools and they were beneficial, truly they were not treated right. And if you look at this, like, there was much hurt and pain brought on by these schools to Indigenous people. It's truly undescribable and embarrassing for our nation to experience this. And as I reflect onto this, I just want to bring up the conversation that a lot of Indigenous communities lose their culture and their background because of these boarding schools. Many of my ancestral ties are unknown because of these schools, and it's sad to hear and to think that people actually went through this. So I also have a video linked here by MSNBC, and they interview Indigenous people and ask them what it was like. What do they remember? How did it feel? What was the treatment of the people on in these boarding schools? And it's disheartening to hear what had happened and that this is a lost idea in American history. So they do share about what harassment they were treated. There was physical abuse, violence, sexual harassment, and it is hard to hear, but it's important to listen to. So as you watch this video, I ask that you just take in what might have happened and consider why this is important. Thank you.
We turn now to our special series, The Vanished. For more than 150 years, the U.S. government sought to forcibly assimilate Native American children as the country expanded into their land. Hundreds of government-funded boarding schools were set up all over the country. There, tribes were separated, Native American traditions were erased, and survivors of those schools say they were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton. Antonia, I know you spoke with some of those survivors, folks who were in some of these, one of the longest running boarding schools of its kind. What did they tell you about their experiences?
That's right, Aaron. So this was a boarding school in northern Michigan in the area called Harbor Springs. And what I learned from tribal leaders and members there and from survivors who are still living after experiencing years in that school system is that survivors have been trying to tell these stories for decades, and they experienced extreme physical abuse, mental abuse, and even sexual abuse in this school there run by the Catholic Church. And although they've tried to raise their voices and talk about this, only now do they feel with a new investigation launched by the federal government that people are listening to them. Take a look at what we learned. When Yvonne Walker-Keshik steps foot on what was once Holy Childhood of Jesus boarding school in Harbor Springs, painful memories come flooding back.
Everything that was Native American, they tried to destroy.
Yvonne was one of thousands of Native American kids, many of them Odawa children, sent to this Catholic boarding school between 1829 and 1983. Students couldn't speak their language or hold on to their traditions.
Every time they beat me up, it got harder and harder to learn. She would grab me by my hair and use me for an eraser, drag me back and forth across the blackboard until she erased the numbers.
In the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States funded more than 350 boarding schools with the goal of assimilating and separating the tribes. Holy Childhood was one of the longest running. Students often describe themselves as survivors of physical and even sexual abuse. Then a terrifying discovery. More than 1,000 bodies found in mass graves at similar schools in Canada. In June, the US government announced a national investigation. Eric Hemingway is the archivist for the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians. He has been uncovering school records and artifacts for decades.
This one,
A 4-year-old.
4-year-old.
To what extent do you think the federal government was successful in its mission?
It was successful, and that many of us don't speak our native language. But in a sense, they're not successful because I'm striving to learn that. Those elements of us as a Anishinaabe are still out there. The language, the customs, the traditions.
Holy Childhood has not responded to requests for comment. Fred Kiogma is Marine Corps veteran, and he says memories from Holy Childhood still haunt him. Getting locked in a freezing closet, the racist remarks. A nun once forced him to eat vomit in front of his brother.
That was 55, 57 years ago. And I can remember the expressions, his tone. and how small I felt.
Survivors say the first step of healing is acknowledgement. What do you think we're going to find out in this investigation, the federal investigation?
I would hope that they find the truth, but you gotta admit that it happened. And that's what I think people are so afraid of, because it tarnishes them. It tarnishes their religion, it tarnishes their town, their school, or whatever, but it shouldn't be that way.
You can see how much these experiences have stuck with survivors. And what they tell me is that they have been able to find healing and hope by creating community, by archiving and collecting all of these records and making sure that within their tribes, within their communities, people never forget that the US now enters this reckoning and answers for what happened to thousands of children.
So important to be able to tell those stories, to collect that history, and for the rest of us to hear the stories and to know what happened and to do our part to make sure it doesn't happen again. Antonia Hilton, we appreciate this.
Thank you.
There is a clear relationship between language and culture, all of which is displayed in the conflicts between the Cherokee people and the missionaries that built on their land. Prior to the missions being built, the Cherokee people operated through oral communication only, having no written texts. However, once the missions were built, missionaries attempted to force the Cherokee to establish a written language, not to preserve the Cherokees and their histories, but rather to convert them to Christianity. The missionaries believed that if they could translate between English and the Cherokee language, that they could teach Protestant Anglo-Saxon culture to the Native Americans that lived there. Protestant educator John Gamble wrote, "It is indispensably necessary for the preservation that they should learn our language and adopt our laws and holy religion." This was the only intention of the missionaries at the time, but what they didn't foresee was the Cherokee being inspired to establish a language of their own. In 1821, a young Cherokee man by the name of Sequoia established a written Cherokee language consisting of 86 characters. Although this alphabet took him 12 years to develop, the effects of his invention have prevailed throughout the years. Unlike the Cherokee language the missionaries attempted to develop, Sequoia's language was actually representative of his culture and his history. Sequoia's written language matched his oral language, and so it was extremely easy for the Cherokee people to pick up on. In fact, it barely took a week for the language to spread, which of course was a threat to the missionaries' made-up Cherokee language and plan. By 1828, it was observed by many that those characters have now become extensively used in the nation. The religious songs are written in them. There is an astonishing eagerness in people of all classes and ages to acquire knowledge of them, as newspaper editor Elias Benoit writes. It was also at this time that the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, was established, a newspaper that is still in circulation today. It is clear that Sequoia's written language and alphabet united the Cherokee people in a way that had never been united before. It is also this written language that helps keep their culture alive and well preserved today. In this video, you will observe some more about the Cherokee Phoenix and its effects on the Cherokee people.
One of the most well-known Cherokees in history is Sequoia, also known as George Guess. He was the inventor of the Cherokee syllabary and the creator of a legacy that extends far beyond the Cherokee Nation.
What's remarkable is that he single-handedly developed that written language, and he would have been the first person in 5,000 years of recorded history to have achieved that type of. Alex Posey, a Greek poet, referred to him as the Cadmus of his race. Cadmus brought the Greek alphabet to the ancient Greeks, and Sequoia brought the syllabary to the Cherokee people. It enabled them to start the first Native American language newspaper. It enabled them to achieve literacy at an alarmingly fast rate. Oral history tells us that he started developing the syllabary before the War of 1812, and that the War of 1812 disrupted that. And it was after he came home from the war, he was able to pick it back up. In 1821 is when he formally introduced the syllabary to the Cherokee. And originally it wasn't as widely accepted as one might have hoped. He and his daughter Ayoka were both put on trial for witchcraft, and what the soldiers had them do was they had to write messages back and forth to each other in separate rooms and pass them back and forth until the soldiers were convinced that the symbols that they were putting onto paper were in fact symbols that represented words in a way of communication.
Sequoia was one of the old settler Cherokees who moved to the area of present-day eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas before the Trail of Tears. By 1829, he was established on this land near Salisaw, where he built a log cabin with his bare hands for himself and his family.
He would have had a small farm here, growing his own food. He had a salt operation that was a common way to earn income for Cherokees in the area. He was not only a scholar, but he was a diplomat. When the Trail of Tears was occurring and the Cherokees were arriving from the east, he helped broker peace between the newly arriving Cherokee and the old settlers wwho were here in what's called the Active Union of 1839. He was one of the signatories on that document.
Sequoia lived in the cabin for 11 or 12 years before undertaking a voyage to Mexico. He was searching for other Cherokees who had moved south. Sequoia died there around 1843. While his burial site remains unknown, his influence can be felt across the country, from the halls of the United States Capitol building to the giant redwood trees of California that bear his name, to this unassuming log cabin in rural Sequoia County, Oklahoma.
All right, so just going to go over a couple resources. This is the textbook. Again, we did chapter 2, and it's just the first 10 pages of that. And then these are the 2 videos that we showed you all from the American Antiquarian and MSNBC. And then our slides, we use Slides Carnival. So thank you everyone very much for paying attention to our presentation. We hope that this was informative to you, and if you have any questions over any of the content that we shared, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to answer your questions.